One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brülosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Listener and patron Jason Cox reached out to us a few months ago to say, quote, "I don't know if you've ever commented on how Brülosophy is structured as a business, but I would like to know more about that." More recently, Sasha Horowitz commented, "It may be a little boring to everyone else, but I'm interested in the operations side of Brülosophy." These are just two of the many requests we've received to go a little more meta than we usually do by talking about stuff like our experiences as content creators and all that goes into keeping Brülosophy afloat. I've so far resisted this suggestion for years, in fact, largely because, like Sasha said, I thought it just might be a little bit boring. But judging by the number of times we've been asked about this type of stuff, well, this is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Will Lovell to talk about all things Brülosophy.
You know, as someone that was a fan of Brülosophy, for lack of a better word, prior to becoming a contributor with Brülosophy, this is actually a show that I'm super excited about. There's a lot of things that I've been more privy to as I've been a contributor over the last year, and I'm kind of excited that we get to share some of those experiences and a lot of the history of Brülosophy here today.
Yeah, this is one of those things I like talking. I mean, I'm a psychologist in my real life, so I kind of like going deep and talking about the underside of things, whatever. Typically, I have some idea of how an episode is going to go. And while we certainly have show notes to keep us on track, very little is actually scripted. It's just bullet points typically. That's just the way I prefer things. For this particular episode, our notes are pretty loosey-goosey to the point I'm really not sure where all of this is going to go as we're chatting about, what it took to start Brülosophy and all of the steps to get us to where we're at today. I think this is going to be a fun one. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. This month's guest is world-renowned author, podcast host, and brewery consultant, a man I've had the pleasure of calling friend for the better part of the last decade. John Palmer will be making his return to the Patreon monthly Q&A livecast stage. That's right, John was one of our very first guests back when we started our Patreon in early 2018, over 5 years ago, which is crazy. And he's coming back to kick it with our supporters. If you're brewing today, chances are some of what you do has been influenced by John Palmer in one way or another. This is going to be a very good session. If you want to be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brülosophy by Friday, September 29th, 2023, as John's going to be taking questions on Saturday the 30th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to review it, we'd really appreciate that. Thanks to everybody who's already rated and reviewed the show. We read every single one of them. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You're not going to be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Ricky Alexander wrote in with feedback after listening to episode 286, where we talked about post-boil pH adjustment, a very esoteric approach, I think, in modern brewing today. Ricky said at one point in the episode, you posed the question, can you think of any time you might want to adjust the post-boil pH up rather than down? I don't recall you guys coming up with anything in the moment, but one thing that immediately came to my mind is that some Kvike strains, such as exBEERience, are known to dramatically drop the pH of the final beer. Maybe this is a good thing if you were planning to drop your pH ahead of fermentation anyway, but this could be one circumstance where raising the post-boil pH may be a useful lever to pull.
I'm actually trying to think about that question because I think it's a really good question. I don't know 100% what you would use post-boil. Maybe you would put some, baking soda in solution or something and then try to raise it. So I'm kind of thinking about what levers you would pull to raise it because it's not as simple as like just adding more lactic acid. And I'm really trying to think of, what are you trying to achieve? Because really, unless you accidentally made a sour, which would probably lead to some other error in your process that's a little more like infection or something, a little more damaging. I can't think of a real reason why you would raise it. Can you, Marshall?
No. I've heard of exBEERience, this Kvike strain, but I've never used it. I've never actually fermented my own beer with Kvike, just because I haven't been a huge fan of the characteristics it imparts. But I'm not even sure I've had a beer that's been fermented with exBEERience or with one of these Kvike strains that dramatically reduces the pH of the beer. That's not something I was aware of. What I'm curious about is whether the pH drop that occurs when fermented with strains like that, if it has a perceptible impact, if you can taste that lower pH, I presume there would be some level of tartness. I mean, if the pH is dropping, what that means is that you have a more acidic solution. And so I would imagine if it's that dramatic, you'd be able to taste it. Maybe that's not the case. Either way, I suppose adding some sort of alkaline compound like, baking soda you mentioned or pickling lime could be one way to combat this if you don't want that. Though it seems like a stretch to me that a yeast would reduce the pH enough for it to be all that perceptible. And if it is, I'm using a different yeast, if I don't want that quality. So I cannot, other than, an accidental over-acidification or something, I can't think of a situation where I would want to increase the pH of post-boil wort before pitching yeast. Usually it's exactly what you don't want to do because you want to create that somewhat acidic environment so that nothing else outcompetes the yeast that you're pitching into it. So I don't know. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. If anybody thinks of some other reason you might want to do that, let us know. I'd be curious to hear your experience with this though. Thanks for the thought-provoking comment though, Ricky. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Alrighty, time for a quick break. When we return, we're going to be discussing our experiences building, managing, and maintaining Brülosophy. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Considering the fact we're approaching our 10-year anniversary, which is just bonkers for me to actually, accept and to think about, there's a lot that's gone on behind the scenes of Brülosophy, far too much to cover in the time we've got today. And for that reason, I've done my best to sort of distill things down to what I believe to be some of the more meaningful components, which I hope adequately addresses the stuff we've been asked about over the years. So I guess the best place to start then is at the beginning. Brülosophy, I've told this story a handful couple of times in the past. So I hate to be terribly redundant. I think for the most part, what I've told is just kind of the basics. So I'm going to do my best to get into a little bit more of the details, some of the unseen stuff here. But Brülosophy was something that got off the ground in 2014. Now, I started it after a close friend and my brewing partner moved away from Fresno. Even as a kid, I had this like seemingly natural and arguably annoying tendency to question things. And my parents, all of my family members remind me of this quite often. But as an adult, I loved that I could actually take certain claims and test them out. And this was going on far before, Brülosophy existed. It was in pretty much every realm. And for the most part, I would do it just to kind of see what was going on, right? I wanted to test these out for myself. I wasn't trying to convince anybody of anything like that. So when my buddy left town in early 2012, it was January of 2012, for me, brewing for brewing's sake sort of lost its pizzazz. So my way of staying interested and keeping involved in the hobby, and at the time, I wasn't very plugged in with the local brewing scene yet. But at the time, I had a batch sparge set up in my garage. It was the whole, 70 quart cooler that I think you saw a lot of back then in the early 2010s. And I built a second identical setup just so I could start testing these things out. For the most part, at the time, I was brewing 2 batches per day anyways. They was just consecutive. So this actually saved some time for me, if not, making the brew day a little bit more hectic. But I started brewing 2 batches side by side and picking at the time what I thought to be some of the bigger variables, some of the things that a lot of people were talking about. And so I started testing things out. I started coming up with what I thought at the time were kind of novel approaches to doing things in the brewery that one saved time while not, having a negative impact on the quality of the beer I was making. At first I just started sharing my findings on home brewing forums. For about a year and a half, that's what I was doing. And as I did that, people started encouraging me to create a website so that there was just a single place people could go to see what I was up to. And that's what I eventually did in February of 2014. There was a really steep learning curve for me. I'd never run a website before. That is a question I get asked all the time is, what were you doing prior to Brülosophy? How many websites did you start? What other businesses and yada. This was the first website I'd ever started. And I taught myself everything for better or for worse on that front. But people seemed to like having this place to go to see what I was doing. And their comments were very reinforcing. Will, I'm curious, because you are kind of a newer contributor. We're going to talk about that in the next segment. But when did you first get introduced to what we were doing at Brülosophy?
So I think what you've described is a natural pattern for a lot of home brewers where like you kind of get started and then once you've been doing it for a while, your interests kind of shift over into like more exploration. And some of it's like, do I split this batch with 2 different yeasts? What do I get? Yeah. Process variables, things that are easy for people to replicate. You took it to a different level, obviously trying to do side-by-side batches. But I guess it was like 2019, 2018 or so. That's when I really started. I'd referenced your articles quite a bit before then, just for random little things like usually you'd have a question. It's like, well, does it really matter if I do this? And then you'd read a Brülosophy article and you're like, well, I understand this isn't set in stone. I understand this is one article, but it gives me pretty good confidence to know that if I do make the substitution, it's not going to ruin my beer.
Yeah.
and that's what I've used Brülosophy for a lot of years was just like, yeah, I can make this substitution. I can take this shortcut. And then really, I guess 2018, 2019, I really started like listening to the podcast more and more. Started, 2020 when I had nothing else to do. I think I caught up on all the podcasts because what was anybody doing in 2020 other than staying home and brewing beer? And so, and that kind of elevated from there. But yeah, it was about that time frame. So I've been a fan for quite a while, but definitely COVID kind of amplified my experimentation and need to like kind of dive into a lot of these process variables.
Yeah, it's funny because I hear from a lot of people who kind of use Brülosophy for almost personal validation. Like, ooh, okay, I messed up here, or I made this substitution. Hey, these guys seem to have gotten away with it. I should be okay. And lo and behold, the beers turn out perfectly fine. So on some level, I'm okay with that, I guess. I'm kind of okay with however people want to use our data. It's just beer. But another question question I suppose I get asked all the time is, when you started Brülosophy, was there some sort of an intention to make it a business? I will say this. I used to, my answer to that used to just be no, not at all. And that's mostly true. You know, I started this as a way to stay interested, to keep myself interested, but also to do things that I love doing, which is testing stuff out. I love that. That's just kind of in my nature. I make jokes, or I get made fun of because I'm the guy who, when everybody else is talking about the latest, you know, fantasy movie that came out, or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, I'm sitting and watching documentaries. I mean, that's just how I was as a kid. My brain doesn't operate the way a lot of people's do.
That's 100% true, by the way. When you make a random Lord of the Rings or like Star Wars reference, he is totally over his head. It's just like it's blank stares, crickets happening. So that's totally true. He does not do any kind of fantasy stuff.
But look, no judgment. I envy the people who have the ability to get into that. What's weird is they don't seem to understand my inability. I fall asleep every time, but a boring documentary will keep me, you know, interested from start to finish. I love it. So anyways, Brülosophy was really driven mostly by that. But that being said, while I can't say that there was any overt intention on my part to turn this thing into its own brand and do all of the legal stuff to create a business with copyrights and all of that, my wife has told me many times that there's nothing I don't do without some perspective of opportunity or potential opportunity. So maybe that was there. I think that is, again, kind of like my love of the documentary and real life stuff. In the same way, yeah, I suppose I do. I'm looking for areas where I can, you know, have some sort of a impact, I guess. And so there was that there. And it didn't take long, you know, for me to see that this was a valid potential, you know, business opportunity here. And, you know, in a very small way. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. But some people refuse to accept that my whole goal with the exBEERience was to personally experience the impact of doing or failing to do certain things, mostly process variables, you know, in my brewing and the impact that they have on my beer. At the time, I was just fully convinced that these variables, I think like most people, the variables that we were testing actually mattered, and that people would be able to perceive the impact that, you know, adjusting those variables or leaving certain things out would have. I was just as surprised as everyone else when our results started to suggest otherwise. But that is not, at least the vocal few who have reached out to me to accuse me of trying to ruin brewing or whatever that is. It seems to be that people just for their own reasons have accepted that my intention in starting Brülosophy was to like flip off traditional brewing practices and, oh yeah, you know, we're just trying to prove that you don't have to do this, to the point that we've received some accusations that we've, you know, we're making up data because there's no way this doesn't matter, and, you know, stuff like that. It's been an interesting ride on that front, but you have to trust that my whole purpose in doing this was because I wanted to taste the negative impact of, say, fermenting on trub, or, you know, fermenting lagers warm, stuff like that. That really was where I was going. To me, this was going to be an educational thing, and it turned out being a little bit more than that, I guess.
Well, I think that's one of the really cool things that you've done, though, is you took a lot of these like traditional methods and maybe they do matter on like a bigger scale. I don't think we've ever said, because home brewing is different than commercial brewing, but I think it's really cool that you took these like kind of commonly held methods, you know, things like decoction, step mashes, and tried to and again, we're not saying there's not an objective difference, but a perceptible difference that people can taste.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. Now, I'm curious, when exactly did you go from, we're just going to test this process variable, to like going full blown diving headfirst into short and shoddy? Like, we're just going to make the whole thing blow it up.
You know what? That is a good question. There was a point, I've got it in my little timeline here. In terms of the timeline, because that happened fairly quickly, fairly soon after we started the whole experiment process, where I'm going, wait a second, why is none of this stuff, or not none of it, but most of this stuff, coming back non-significant? And you can trust the data, you can trust the p-value, you can choose not to. That's completely on you. Whatever you choose to do, the beauty of it is this is not cancer research. You know, we're not hurting anybody. This is all about beer. And that's what made this like a safe place for me to do all of this experimentation. Now, before we even even did the experiment series, I wrote a couple articles about my approach to things like harvesting yeast from starters and making using a quick lager method that I later learned was similar to what Mike Tasty McDole was doing. He and I have actually talked about it and kind of compared notes. There are some slight differences, but the concept behind what we were doing was exactly the same. Anyways, those are what I credit as putting us on the map, but it was really the response to the experiment articles that motivated us to keep doing this thing and to take Brülosophy in a somewhat different direction than I'd originally planned. I knew I wanted to do experiments, right? But I didn't realize that was going to be our bread and butter. That was going to be what I hadn't really thought about what was going to be our bread and butter at the time. And the experiment thing started very soon after we published our first article. Now, after a few months of pushing out like intermittent articles with very little organization, I made a personal commitment to publishing an experiment article every other week. At the time, it was just me, so you can imagine how often I was brewing, but pretty much every single weekend, 2 batches side by side. That's what I was doing. And I'm doing it mostly on my own, waking up before my family wakes up. I've got 3 very young kids at the time, 1 infant. It was nuts, but I loved doing it. And I think that knowing that I had something to push out there, some sort of content, was an extra, added motivation. So right around the 1-year mark, I was contacted by Greg Foster, who expressed interest in what I was doing, as well as Ray Found soon after that. So I asked them if they just wanted to contribute to Brülosophy, and thankfully both of them agreed. I am absolutely confident we would not be where we're at today if it weren't for the 2 of them coming on board. That was what ultimately gave me the idea that, wow, I don't have to take this whole thing on myself, and maybe we can make something more of Brülosophy than what it is now. So with the 3 of us actively brewing experiments, we made the decision to move to weekly publishing back in February of 2015. And what's crazy is we have not missed a week since then. So it's been almost 8 years that we've been doing the weekly experiments without missing a beat. And that is fully to the credit of the contributors. We'll talk about all of the contributors here in a bit. But soon after that, though, as soon as we made that move to weekly publishing, Malcolm Fraser joined the crew and decided to start publishing an additional weekly article, most of which at the time were actually more experiments. Though we soon reserved those Thursday slots for product reviews, method discussions, and the like. And then in August of 2015, we introduced the Hop Chronicle series. And then to get to your question, Will, it was fairly soon after that, when the Hop Chronicles gained traction very quickly, that we dropped the first Short and Shoddy article a few months later. When I did the first Short and Shoddy beer, though, there's a little bit of a story behind that one. I was not planning on it becoming like its own series. I was, again, despite having done at this point, 30 or 40 experiments that came back non-significant, I was pretty convinced this idea that I had to throw together some leftover grains that had been sitting out, uncovered for a year into a 3-gallon batch and ferment it warm with lager yeast and do all of these crazy things. I was wholly convinced this beer was just not going to turn out. But I had a buddy's birthday party, a professional brewer's birthday party coming up. And I thought, they all expect me to serve weird stuff at this point anyways. Why not take this beer that I ended up calling Short and Shoddy? Why not take this over there, serve it to them and see what they think of it? Well, it turned out this beer was super clean, surprisingly good. It tasted lemony because I believe I used at the time some leftover, what was it? Glacier hops or something like that, or Denali hops. But anyways, it was really nice. And so that was kind of the shocker for me, going, okay, what happens if I keep doing this? If I stack all of these variables that are, supposed to lead to bad beer, and do them all together to make specific styles. And so that was sort of the genesis of the short and shoddy thing. And I think it took, probably another 6 months to maybe a year before we actually started doing more regular short and shoddy articles, when I adopted the idea to go through the entire BJCP guidelines and try to brew each beer using these short and shoddy methods. But it's a regular part of Brülosophy now. It's one of the things that we're known for, and I think it's a lot of fun.
So I absolutely love Short and Shoddy. If you want to know probably the article series that really started getting me more and more interested into it was Short and Shoddy, because I have small children as well. And anything you can do if you're trying to squeeze in a beer to cut out an hour here of your brew day, anything you can do is is amazing. And so like I've always been there, and I absolutely think one of the best podcasts you ever did was Short and Shoddy, when you had Malcolm Fraser, who actually brewed a Short and Shoddy, because Malcolm, at least from what I understand, is super traditionalist, like really likes his processes, and just describing him driving this Short and Shoddy beer. I think he took it to HomebrewCon, I think, is where I think he drove it to, and you drank it out of his car, and hearing him describe that in that podcast episode of like how nervous he was and if it was going to turn out is like great radio, just knowing what I know about Malcolm.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. He was in Baltimore, I believe. He brought his keg to serve for our talk that we were doing there. It was the first time Malcolm and I had met in person, and so he drove down from Pittsburgh and I flew over from California, and yeah, he had this beer in the back of his car, and he's looking at me like, we got to try it first. He does not like to share beer with people. That's beer that's just not good. And again, this beer is a little sulfury before he left Pittsburgh, but that kind of shook itself out, as it were, during his drive, and the beer was great, and everybody agreed. For the most part, everybody agreed. He was pretty shocked by it, but that's kind of the idea. Is we're not trying to say, hey, look, you don't have to do these other things. We're saying it's kind of fun if you experiment and play around with your beer a little bit, and that's more of, if we're encouraging anything, it's that. So, well, by June of 2016, we brought on a couple more contributors, Matt Waldron and Jake Houlihan, which made keeping up with our commitments a bit easier. And then in early 2017, not only did Matt Del Fiacco become a contributor, but that is when we announced the Brülosophy podcast, which you're listening to right now. We'd been getting a lot of pressure from our fans of the website to start a podcast, which contributor Ray found was very strongly supportive of. So after months of planning, we bit the bullet and started releasing bi-weekly episodes, which turned into weekly episodes just a few months later. And again, we've just kind of stuck to it. One of the things that we get a lot of comments on, and I really appreciate this, it's something I'm not a proud person, but it's something I take a little bit of pride in, is our sound quality. People ask me, like, how did you know how to do that? What, you guys sound pretty doggone good. I record music as another hobby. I've been writing songs and recording music since, 2003. Maybe a little bit before that. And that's just the recording part of things. And so I'd already had some experience with, digital audio workstations and I had, nice microphones and all of the stuff to make music sound okay for a home recording. And so my thing with the Brülosophy podcast was making sure it sounded good enough. And I honestly think with whatever we're doing, we sound a little bit better than good enough at times. So I love all of the comments that we get when people comment on the sound quality. I could do a whole episode just geeking out on like our gear and what we do, our recording process and how it all works. But that's for like another episode if we ever even get there. But
it also kind of explains why we were on like SoundCloud for so long, because that's totally where artists would put stuff and not necessarily podcast people.
Yeah, good eye there, Will. We did start off on SoundCloud because that's what I knew from the music side of things. I still have all my music on SoundCloud, but I learned my lesson. All of this has been a huge learning curve for me. And we moved over to an actual, legit podcast server, Libsyn. I must have been 2019 or so. That was a fun process trying to transfer everything over, but we took care of that. Anyways, in the fall of 2017, so right after we started the Brülosophy podcast, both Brian Hall and Jason Cipriani joined the crew. By this time, Greg Foster and Matt Waldron were no longer contributing, so Brian and Jason mostly served as replacements, and amazing ones at that. Both of them really added to what we were doing. We kicked along for a full year before Phil Rusher became a contributor. If you listen to the recent reminder episode, or kind of harkening back episode of Jersey and Tim,
From Rusher with Love.
That's right. And in fact, he sent me that beer. Here's a little inside scoop. He sent me that beer to kind of prove that he had brewing chops, right? He's like, hey, I'm going to send you some beers, kind of show you how I brew, my skill set, but also feel free to review them on the, on the Brülosophy podcast. And so that's what we did. And it was just a few months later that Paul Amico all but took over the Hop Chronicles series. This was January of 2019, 5 years after, launching Brülosophy. So at this point, we've got a fairly decent sized crew. crew of people who are dedicated to the cause and brewing all the time. And so that's kind of where we were at. Now, around this time, sometime in early 2019, maybe mid 2019, that's when the Brew Club got off the ground. Now, I refer to this as like the original iteration of the Brew Club. It was kind of started by us, Brülosophy, at the request of some fans. And so, I think we started the Facebook page, but our whole thing was we don't have the time and energy to invest into this. And so a couple of people kind of came up and formed this quasi leadership team. Well, in doing that, we came up with this series called the Brew Club Experiment Series, which is where members of the club perform their own experiments with the opportunity to have it published on the website. This is how I was introduced to Cade Job, who I ended up meeting in person at the 2019 BYO boot camp in Asheville, North Carolina, where I was a guest speaker. BYO flew me out there to give, I guess you call it a guest speaker, but really it was more like a lecture with Denny and Drew. I knew right away that Cade was exactly the type of person we needed on Brülosophy, so I asked if he'd contribute, and he said yes. So that was back in 2019.
I've heard Steve Thanos refer to the Brew Club as like the Brülosophy B League, where it's just like you're prepping people to come up, because that's how Cade, that's how myself and Alex Shanksable all kind of got involved in this thing. So it's but it is a really cool opportunity there with the Brew Club Experiment Series to like get, if you have a problem with the recipe that we use for a variable, guess what? Use your recipe. Prove us wrong.
Yeah, that's right. So we were kind of chugging along doing our thing up until March of 2020, which is when COVID hit. That's the whole COVID pandemic thing. And that really did force us to like reevaluate what we were doing. I mean, we could no longer go out and collect data. And so we had to, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it. We had to pivot, and come up with, or I think the better word is adapt. We had to come up with some new way of keeping the content flowing that I felt was our responsibility at this point. We'd come to be expected to provide, brewers with at the very least some form of entertainment. And what more important time if we had to do this than during the COVID pandemic, right? People are brewing at home more, but they can't go out and share it. They don't have anybody to talk to about it. So I viewed what we did at that point as, all right, we are helping people to stay, involved, to stay entertained. And so that's what we did. We adapted. We continued to produce our regular content. I don't think we skipped any weeks during that time at all. Now, despite COVID, we brought Andy Carter on board in May of 2020. Andy Carter is was the current president of the California Homebrewers Association. So it's cool to have that, influence on board. He's still currently on board. He's just on a hiatus because he just moved into a new home and he's got to get all that set up. So at this point, contributors Ray Found, Jason Cipriani, and Malcolm Fraser had taken a step back from Brülosophy. So Andy's presence was very much welcomed. And then in November of 2020, Steve Thanos joined the crew. And in February of 2021, we started the Brew Lab podcast hosted by Cade Job. That whole thing could be its own podcast as well, the story behind how that got going. But Cade had moved, the Cliff's Notes version is Cade had moved from Austin to Oregon. He's up in, not Asheville, God, where's it at? Corvallis anyways. Auburn or whatever, Corvallis, Oregon, where he's going to school with Tom Shellhammer now. And because of that, he wanted to kind of do a different spin on, brewing content and really dig in to the more sciencey side, the hard science side, by interviewing, brewing researchers, people who have done the hard research in labs and stuff like that. And so we spent a whole year building up this idea and coming up with content and launched the Brew Lab in February of 2021, and that's been a great success as well. So by the middle of that year, we'd lost Brian Hall and Matt Del Fiacco. Life happens. So to fill that void, we brought on Mike Neville in September, and just a few months before that, both Phil Rusher and Jake Houlihan also had to call it quits. So at this point, we're losing all of our OG contributors, but we're bringing on kind of fresh blood and new ideas and stuff. And so I'm just at this point, I'm just trying to go with the flow and see where we're at. Now, having had a couple of his Brew Club experiments published on this site, I talked to you, Will, about joining the crew sometime in the middle of 2022, about a year and a half ago. And then in January of this year, Jordan Folks came on board board, followed shortly thereafter by Martin Keene, who you all know as the host of the Brülosophy show. And a few months after that, we added Ryan Hansen to more or less replace Paul Amico, who had some life changes and stuff come up. And we also added contributor Alex Shanks Abel. And so that's where we're at today with all of the contributor things. The reason I wanted to go over that in such detail, Will, is because I have people still reaching out to me saying, hey, we haven't heard from Ray in a long time, or what's going on with Jake? Haven't heard about him. And the truth of the matter is, like I said, life just happens. You know, people had kids. When we started Brülosophy, Jake didn't have any kids. By the time we were done and he finally took a step back, he had 3. So that kind of stuff happens, you know? And so we've just kind of, like I said, we've had to adapt. We've had to deal with those changes. And I think with where we're at now, we've got a pretty solid set of people who are committed. We're all done having our kids. Well, not all of us are done having our kids, but most of us are. And so our focus is just a little bit different, but I love the guys who helped us build us up to where we're at today. Just as much as I love all of you guys, Will, all the people who are with us now, helping us to keep this thing going and providing fresh insights and new ideas. But that is how we got to where we're at today in almost September of 2023.
No, I think it's really cool that you've been able to like get in such great people throughout this entire process, because from Ray Found and Greg Foster to, Malcolm and Jake and Brian and all those guys all along the way, up into the present day crew, you've had really great people step into these roles as contributors, and you've still managed to get really great people to kind of like keep feeding into this thing that is Brülosophy, which is, kind of your brainchild. It definitely is your brainchild. I shouldn't say kind of, it definitely is your brainchild. It's definitely was bore from you, but it's really cool that we've been able to keep this thing going and get it to a manageable level to where these contributors can come in and we can keep this content around, because it's pretty cool.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier about, the Brew Club in particular kind of serving as this kind of like preparatory, group of people who I pluck from, or we really pluck from, because just as well as any past contributor or current contributors will, that everything we do is a group discussion. I mean, this really is, in a weird way, it's like a little democracy where everybody has some input. There's no dictator. I don't feel like that. Maybe you guys think something different when I'm not around, but there's a lot of input from the entire group, and that's what I value. And so it may be that, Will, you come to me one day and you're like, hey, there's this person in the Brew Club who's kicking ass and doing these experiments that really work well, that are clean enough to really fit in with what we're doing. And I would go and I'd talk to them and we'd have a conversation, and maybe we'd, get some beers sent in and all of that. And then eventually that would be how somebody gets added. That's a question, again, I get asked all the time, is where are these contributors coming from? What are their expectations? What do they do? So really, we have no set approach. Some contributors joined after reaching out to me. That would be like Greg and Ray, while I've reached out to others. That'd be like you, Will. The biggest thing I'm after are people who are passionate about brewing, who can stick to their commitments, and who value the homebrewing community. I can honestly say that is wildly different as the personalities, who have been involved with Brülosophy have been, and boy, have they been different. I love all of it. That's what adds color to this otherwise drab world. And it's just fun for me to have that kind of, and there's been internal conflict. I mean, you can't deny any of that stuff, but it's never been anything big. It's never been a big deal, at least a big enough deal for it to I guess, ruin anything. But I like that. I like having people of different stripes and personalities and thought processes, because again, it kind of adds color to this whole thing. So for those who are curious, all of the contributors who are no longer with us did leave on good terms. There's no bad blood whatsoever. And most of us have actually stayed in contact. We still text for the holidays and birthdays and stuff like that. So sometimes, like I said, life just happens.
Yeah, I can attest that. I've reached out to some former contributors to come on and like talk to the Brew Club, and there's never been like this whole anything bad to say anywhere, either in a meeting in public or in private. Like they're all pretty legit cool people, and just and for the most part, like they're all about the brewing community and home brewing, and they're like us. We just want to make this hobby better and more available to everybody, and get as much content and information out there as possible. So, and then people can do with it what they will. Now one thing I kind of like to talk about, like how you talked about our process a little bit and how we talk about it, but I have actually pinged Marshall, said, hey, what do you think about this thing? He's like, shoot it to the group. So we have like a group email. If you send it to this email, it goes to this whole group. And then it's really cool to watch these processes come back, because sometimes it's a variable that maybe you don't know much about. So you have to go do a little research before you can actually speak into it. Sometimes it's something that people have lots of opinions about. And so it goes back and forth. And so maybe what you pitched doesn't actually get picked up as it is, but it'll just kind of morph into something that's like more meaningful to the group. And you kind of just have to have this, no butt hurt, no hard feelings mentality, because they're not picking apart your idea because they hate you. They're just picking apart your idea because we want to put the best idea out there that we can. And Marshall, you do have quite a bit of say in this. There are some things where we're like, hey, that is a Marshall question because it's something very specific. But in general, it is mostly kind of what the group thinks, and we all feed into this whole process. So
yeah. Well, I am an admitted control freak, and hopefully you've noticed this, Will. Over the last 6 months or so, I've really been trying to step back and watch how these processes, go, and just trying to trust the process more than I trust myself. It's a little bit arrogant to say, but yeah, I agree that I understand that there's final word, comes from me most of the time, but for the most part, I love the way. I mean, we've got some really deep thinkers on the crew right now. One of the funny things about that, though, just as an aside, is when, if we publish something and then we get a comment that's like, oh, it would have been way better if you'd done it this way. Bro, if you don't think that we didn't already consider that, we had to choose something. Why don't you? This is what I want to tell people, and I never do online. But if you have a critique, I'm all good with that. But if you're saying it would have been better, then just go do it yourself, because clearly you've got the chops to do it. And if you do it, I promise you, reach out to me. We'll probably publish your results for you. But we have to take things stepwise. And there are often times that by focusing on a specific variable, you are, alternatives exclude, as Irv Yalom used to say. By doing it one way, you're kind of excluding these other things that we understand people want to see tested, and we will likely get to at some point in the future, but we did it this way. So, but yeah, that's one of the things. And just a note again on the kind of the churn of contributors. I was trying to think with all but maybe one, the reason for taking a step back had to do with the expectations that we have on contributors, and it is a bear. I mean, we're not just sitting around, twiddling our thumbs brewing beer like your regular weekend home brewer. This is like work. You mentioned it in the last episode, Will, that and it kind of stuck with me because this is, like you said, it's kind of my baby, and you guys are involved, and I hopefully it's rewarding enough to keep you guys around. But you'll wake up and you're like, I wasn't going to brew today, but I know I've got to get content, for the site or for the podcast. And like, that is a very real feeling. And I think at some point it just burns people out, or something else comes up in their real life where they're like, that's it. I don't have the time to focus on this anymore. And it's a lot. And so somebody asked, I think it was Sasha who asked about what do you expect from contributors? Will, you can speak to this as well, but every contributor is expected to commit to brewing at least one experiment and then one of something else every month at a baseline. So that's 2 brew days, which usually is 3 batches, because the experiments are often, almost always 2 batches side by side. So that is the expectation. We're kind of working on, who's doing the Hop Chronicles, who's doing Short and Shoddy, who's doing a brew it yourself, so that there's not too much overlap there. But that's a big expectation when this is supposed to be a hobby, and that conversion of a hobby into a quasi job can have an impact on the way that I guess you experience something that is fun for you to do. And like you said, Will, we consult about everything before doing it. On a brew it yourself, somebody might throw an idea out there, and because of the nature of that series, we're not collecting data on it. It really is kind of our throwback to the old school homebrewing blog thing, where it's just like, hey, I brewed this, here's what I think about it. So that one we don't really vet too hard. But when it comes to experiment variables, or all of our Hop Chronicles are brewed the same exact way, regardless of who's brewing it. That's just kind of the way that we do things at Brülosophy to keep them as clean, our findings as clean as possible. possible. So,
well, even short and shoddy recipes, we still throw those out there because I had one recently that I brewed up, and you're like, well, you're kind of drifting a little far here, so reel it back in. And so I had to kind of reel in how out there I was going to go with the short and shoddy to make it a little more reasonable to style. But yeah, so again, lots of things get critiqued, and again, it's not out of like hate or malice. And I love our team right now because Steve Thanos is so creative, and then we have Jordan, who's like so traditionalist. I think me and Alex are somewhere in between, and Ryan's got some good ideas out there. We just have a really good crew at like expressing, getting these ideas, and then Martin Keene has been just great as well. Just his way of viewing things, and so it's really great to get all this feedback and all of this. On your experiments, on your recipes, on your variables. And then also, if you have a problem, you have a pretty great wealth of knowledge there that you can just ping in an instant and get some feedback almost instantly from, which is also amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. That's one of the things that I've always found incredibly valuable about having the crew that we have had and that we do have today is rather than hitting the internet like, the majority of people out there who have a question about a certain variable, I can go to this relatively small group of Brülosophy contributors and say, here's my thought on this. What do you guys think? And it creates a 2-day long conversation, right? And I just think there's so much value in that. And as a people person, it's also that in those discussions you're creating connections that are going to last a lifetime, and I think that's one of the probably the most rewarding aspects of doing Brülosophy so far. Just to finish off these whole contributor expectations, another one, we do have a no butt hurt rule. We laugh about it, but science in the end, and I know people will argue, oh, that's what you're doing is not science. Well, it's a little bit more science than your presumptions is what I tell people. But it doesn't care about feelings. If you're going to present an idea for an experiment variable, for example, and you drop it in the group email and you're going to get offended by somebody saying, I think you should do this or that, or this seems like it's not going to work out. Well, then there's not really a place for you here because we do want to whittle it down into being the cleanest, experimental approach possible. There was one time you were talking about short and shoddy and me commenting on, well, maybe you should make a change here or there. I forget who it was. It was a couple years ago, though. A contributor, brewed up a short, shoddy batch. I think I was too busy to jump on the email at the time or whatever. And they brewed it up and they send me all the info. And I'm looking at it going, well, 45-minute mash rest. That's okay. That's a little bit shorter than usual. A 90-minute boil. You hopped everything normally and you fermented it, pitched cool, fermented it. I said, what was the short and shoddy part of it? And they were like, well, you can't do all of that stuff together. It's going to make bad beer. And I'm like, but that's the whole point of this. Getting that across and realizing that each contributor, when they're doing certain things, whether it's an experiment or a short and shoddy in particular, you are taking a risk. You may have to dump that batch. And I mean, that deserves some credit. Most people don't want to take that risk. And that's one of the things that we've embraced. So I think that's one of the cooler aspects of it. Finally, in terms of expectations, the co-hosting the podcast is totally optional. I don't think we've ever had an issue getting contributors to want to be on the Brülosophy podcast to co-host. There are people who are more interested in it than others, and that's perfectly cool. But that's also something that contributors get to do. Now, a question that I believe it was Jason Cox asked specifically is, are Brülosophy contributors considered employees of Brülosophy? And the answer to that is no. They are technically considered contractors. Everybody receives a 1099 at tax time every year, and they're responsible for paying their own taxes on what little earnings they accrue for the work that they put into Brülosophy. My wife is our accountant. She is actually a CPA, so that works out in my favor big time. Again, there's no way we would be the business we are today, as small as we are, without her help and on the financial side of things. So they are not considered employees. They are considered contractors. All past and current contributors, including yours truly, hold regular full-time jobs. None of us are doing this thing as a full-time job. And as sad as this may sound to you, there is no way this could be anybody's full-time job. It just does not generate enough revenue. That's not to say that I don't wish it would, or that we're not profiting on some level. We are. There's no denying that, but it's not like, massive money profit. We're going off to the Bahamas with Brülosophy cash,
Okay. We need to pause here though. We need to pause here because I have heard you say out loud that you spend 40 to 50 hours a week on Brülosophy.
Oh.
And yet you've now just admitted that you have a full-time job. So now we're looking at, probably 40 hours at your normal job, another 40, 50 hours at this job. And you still don't have a trip to the Bahamas or a Porsche to show for it?
When I go on, I'll tell you what, people have probably noticed if you follow me on Facebook. I don't know why people want to follow my private Facebook account, but they do. That you've seen pictures of us on, we took a lot of vacations this summer, kind of our post-COVID blowback, my wife is hugely into the whole travel hacking thing. So, it's kind of cool because we look like jet setters, but we're not paying for those tickets. Our points are, and that's just from, you use these credit cards and they give you big amounts of points and you do that. No, there is not this, I remember about 2-3 years into Brülosophy as we're climbing that hill of success, thinking, wow, this really could turn into something that I can make my full-time job, and that just, I don't know if it's because of the way we've set it up or the way we've structured it. I refuse to go too far into the more shilly side of content creation. I'm not really into that. I know people are curious about the financial side of things and cynical about anybody who generates any amount of revenue off of something they claim to love. I don't know what to tell you. Nobody's getting rich off of this gig, but it is absolutely not sustainable to invest 40 to 50 hours a week, if not more than that, into something and not benefit from it. So, your opinions are your opinions. Most of the money that we generate, the revenue that we generate off of this show, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next segment, but it goes right back into Brülosophy in one form or another. And it's not cheap. I mean, where are all these colored cups coming from? The glasses that we use for all of our articles, all that stuff has to get paid for. The server space, the security stuff. It's not cheap is all I'm saying. And we love doing it. I try not to whine too much about it. But yeah, so there's that side of it. We all have full-time jobs. Just keep that in mind. And yes, I do invest 40 to 50 hours a week. Where do you find that time? I was up at 6:30 this morning on a Saturday to record this episode before my family got up and before I go do family things. And while I'm doing that, I'm replying to emails, and I'm going to get home and I'm going to edit and I work a 4-day, 10-hour a day work week at my normal job. So I spend that 5th day, my Mondays are spent 10 hours that day just doing Brülosophy stuff. So it's a labor of love on some level, but we, I don't think our wives, our spouses would appreciate if we weren't some way, benefiting from it. And it was just something we were doing for fun. That's a lot of time to invest in something that's just for fun. So I think that's all I've got for the contributor side of things.
I just want to add, it is fun. Okay. And sometimes, we talked about earlier, you're dragging out of bed to go brew 10 gallons of beer where you probably wouldn't do it another day. And sometimes I do get anxiety around finding time to brew, finding time to collect data. That's not a big deal, right? But when I'm in the process of brewing, I still love brewing. I still love sitting there, and I love smells. I love everything about it. And collecting data, while I do get some anxiety because I got to go find. You would be amazed how hard it is to find 20 people to drink beer. Sometimes it's way harder than you think it should be. You're giving away beer for the love of anything. Please come drink beer. And sometimes it's hard to find 20 plus people to drink beer. I don't know why, but sometimes it's just harder than others. So, but in the process of data collection, especially if I can do it in groups and stuff like that, I enjoy sitting there, collecting this data, talking with these people and interacting with them. It's a very pleasant process for me. But sometimes there is anxiety about when am I going to get this done? Because I have kids, we have softball commitments, we have soccer commitments, we have doctor's appointments, we have all the things that everyone else has, plus an additional commitment and a full-time job. And I'm not complaining because I obviously enjoy this or I wouldn't do it. But that's just something to keep in mind out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, my daughter, the first week of school, they started last week and she's in cross country, and we got the notification just yesterday after you and I had already planned on recording this episode, which we record about, usually 2 to 3 days ahead of time. So it's pretty current. It's not like we're pre-recording too far ahead, but we got the notification yesterday that she had a pancake mile run this morning, and so my wife is off doing that while I'm sitting here working. I mean, it's a part of the sacrifice that we make, as much fun as it is. Do I wish I was out supporting my daughter in her first cross country run of the season? I do. But I had this commitment and, we have to work around that. So again, this isn't, I understand the kind of knee jerk reaction to think, oh, these guys are just on their high horse and they're doing this thing and it's all for fun and they shouldn't be profiting. We wouldn't be here if we didn't benefit from this. And that's just the way it works here in this good country of ours. And I don't know how else to put that out there. So I think that about covers most of the general aspects of Brülosophy. I wanted to lay that foundation of our history so that what we talk about in the next segment can be kind of, hung up on these different time points and such like that. So we'll be talking more about, what it takes to do Brülosophy when we're back from this short break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. In the nearly 10 years I've been doing this whole Brülosophy thing, I feel like I've learned quite a bit about a variety of things, from running a small business to dealing with presumptive people who think they know more about what's going on than they really do. I mean, typically when somebody calls us out for something, one, they're hoping other people notice that they called us out and jump on their bandwagon. It's fine with me, but you have to understand my original passion and where the name Brülosophy came from was in studying the human condition, whether that was reading, classic philosophers, reading modern psychologists, whatever it is. And so I'm not a judgmental person, but it's not too difficult to see what's actually going on and to recognize a person's insecurities and how that's driving some of the comments they leave for us at times. But regardless, out of concern that I might come across as overly defensive, I did tend to refrain from talking too much about the more personal side of this gig and the way certain things impact me, or even just running Brülosophy has affected my life. But seeing as so many people have asked, that's sort of the direction I think we'll take this next segment. Again, Will, I'm not entirely sure where we're going to go, but what do you think?
I think that when people come and we talked about it a little bit earlier, there are some people with like honest critiques. And I obviously appreciate all the honest critiques and like the thoughtful critiques that are out there, because again, these experiments, nothing that we do is perfect. Nothing in experimentation is perfect. There's this thing called real world where you have to kind of hit the rubber meets the road. We do get some rather sanctimonious criticism from time to time. I think that's a good word for it. I have been accused of killing people with coffee beer before, so I mean that's a fun one. But that's just kind of comes with the territory. You got to be a little bit tongue in cheek. If you're gonna hate on it, then at least that means you read it, right?
Yeah, that's what we say sometimes is I remember talking with Jake back in the day. He would see these comments and he's like, where do these people come off? I don't get it. And my response to him was just reply to it. Hey, thanks for reading. Hey, you read it. If your complaint is that, fill in the blank, either, oh, you got ads on your website or the way you approach this is wrong. I mean, at the very least, you're still reading it. So we appreciate the click. But yeah, the truth of the matter is you have to have somewhat of a thick skin, I think, to be out there in any realm, not just home brewing, but to put yourself out there. Be prepared to get called out. That is kind of a popular thing these days. People like to feel good about themselves, despite whether they actually do or not. And so one way of accomplishing that is by tearing other people down. Well, we'll be your beating post if you need us to be. That's fine. And we've experienced that quite a bit over the years. You're not gonna hurt our feelings at this point, I promise. So, a more detailed question. We finished the last segment by talking about the time commitment and everything that it takes to make sure that we're, actually keeping Brülosophy afloat. But I've gotten questions, and I'll be curious to hear your response after, a year and a half or so of contributing, Will. But is how do you do this? How do you manage having a full-time job, having a family? I've got 3 kids, doing all of that and keeping Brülosophy going at the same time. That seems like an impossibility. And honestly, I think without the group of contributors we have, I know for a fact it wouldn't be possible. But I have been able to manage it. I think a big part of that is the support of my wife. She very much sees and recognizes the value that I get. One, when I started this, the value that I got out of brewing, engaging in the community, all of that stuff. And so there were times though, where I'm waking up early in the morning to brew 2 batches of beer at 4:00, and she's looking and saying, "You are crazy. What are you doing? Sleep. It's your Saturday. Sleep in." And I wasn't doing that, and so, or there'd be times where we were leaving for a trip and I'd have to come home from work early to knock out a batch real quick so that when I got home, I had a beer to keg because I needed to have that article ready 2 weeks later, So things like that, it does get in the way. Arguably. And so, but that again, that I think the way we've been able to sustain is because of the support, not only of the contributors, but our families. My kids know, they were raised in Brülosophy. My youngest was born on July 4th of 2013 is when she was born. And I was already doing some of the stuff that would later become Brülosophy at the time. We started the website in February of 2014. She wasn't even a year old yet. She is now 10 years old. So she doesn't know a world without this thing. Her half of the shirts she sleeps in are Brülosophy shirts. She's got Brülosophy stickers all over her Nalgene bottles, and it's just a part of her world at this point. So the impact on my family life, I think, it's notable. It's there, but it hasn't ruined anything. I don't think, at least. But
I've just tried to keep I think you've had a whole episode on this, and I know you do as well. I try to just keep my kids involved. One of the funny stories, before I joined Brülosophy, my daughter was at her preschool, and they asked what do you use grain for? And her answer was to make beer. And the teacher pulled me aside to be like, "Hey, your daughter said this to me." And I'm like, "Well, it's true. And I brew my own beer. So I'm actually a little bit proud of her, but I get what your point is." Yeah. And so there is this kind of balance of, having all this beer around, having people over all the time to collect data on and drink beer with, and so you have to kind of take that into account as you're doing all this. But my daughter, anytime we talk about beer or a brewery or anything, she just rolls her eyes and it's about beer and rolls her eyes. It's pretty fantastic. So there is that. But I've been brewing for as long as my daughter's been alive, and we lived in Germany when she was born, and I wasn't brewing as much, but she's just kind of grown up with me brewing. And so when we took on Brülosophy, I've had to make time to brew beer. Sometimes I'm brewing on a Friday night when my wife's working late. Not because I want to brew on my Friday night, but that's when I have time, and that's when there's slack space there. And the same thing, sometimes you get up early on a Saturday morning, turn on the European football and watch some Bundesliga so that because you're up early enough to see it, and just, you're trying to knock out a batch, right? So there definitely are those times where I have brewed beer, not because I necessarily would have otherwise, but because we just, like you said, we got to crank out content and get these things moving so we can meet these commitments that we made. And they are commitments that we agreed to. That was, I guess, when I was considering joining Brülosophy, that was one of the things, was the commitment to the articles, which wasn't a huge deal. It hasn't really increased my brewing that much. Kind of the bigger deal to me on the brewing front was that now I'm not necessarily brewing, I want to use honey in a beer as a variable. Great. Well, I would rather brew a honey amber, but because of the variable, it makes more sense to brew a honey blonde. And so now I can't brew exactly what I wanted to brew. Now I have to kind of adjust what I'm brewing. And so then you're just like racking your brain. Well, what's a hoppy variable so I can get something hoppy on tap? Because I'm tired of all these blonde ales.
That's funny. I remember one time, I forget who it was, but one of the older contributors had commented that it used to be that I would come up with these crazy ideas and that would dictate what I brew. And now it's the variable dictates, what I'm brewing. So like I want a hoppy beer. So I've got to find a variable, like you said, that it has to do with like a lot of hops or whatever. That's actually a part of the reason that we integrated the Brew It Yourself series was because, all of us kind of recognized, God, if we're just making pale lager and blonde ale for these experiments all the time, for the most part, how boring is that? None of us are going to be wanting to drink our beer. Our neighbors are going to get annoyed that we're not making amber ale or double IPA or English, English bitter. And so that was a part of the reason behind doing that. But it absolutely, I mean, that's just the way this works. It's a part of the sacrifice again.
Well, I love pale lager as much as anybody, but it's like, would I really use Matueka? Because I think I really want to use Sots. That's really what I want to use.
Exactly. Oh man. Well, I think it's about time we tackle one of the bigger things that I think people wonder about and that a few are willing to ask about, and that's kind of the financial part of Brülosophy. I'm not going to get into numbers. I don't see the point in doing that. I will say that we spend far more than people think. We generate far less than what people think based on some of the emails that I've received. This is not like I said, this is not something that's making anybody rich. I will be honest. I mentioned it earlier. There was a time in my doing this Brülosophy thing earlier on, about 3 to 4 years in, right around when we were starting the Brülosophy podcast, where I thought, holy hell, this thing could be my primary source of income, and I can make this a real business that supports my family as well as in some level supporting the families of other people. That just didn't pan out, and I think a part of that is because you had mentioned in the just recently here, Will, that so much of what we do is focused on making sure that we have available content. That could easily turn into the content is crap now just because we have to get it out there. So we're not doing it the good way anymore. I have refused to go down that route. I'd rather not publish something than to publish crap. And so one way that we've been able to ease that pressure is by adding more and more contributors. Well, we do. Each contributor is compensated for their contributions to Brülosophy. Now that compensation it's a flat number. It's not that much, and it's to be used to cover the costs of non-sponsored ingredients, gear, stuff like that. I mean, that is what people are now. Does that mean you can go out on a Friday and cover your beer? Absolutely. That's the hope, right? I don't see that as being a bad thing. You're investing your time, you are investing literal energy, whether that's propane or electricity at home. And you're putting all of this work in, you're giving away half of your beer, if not more than that. That deserves to be rewarded. So I don't have any issues with that. Brülosophy, at the end of the day, is a business. Now, it is a small business. We're not even an LLC, meaning, and that's, again, my wife is an accountant. She used to work for the IRS, so she's the one who's kind of decided all of these things for me. But that means in order for us to stay around, we have to generate some amount of revenue. We have to be able to pay for this thing. We have to be able to cover our costs, which in my opinion include our time investment. And if that bothers you, I don't know what to tell you. We are not a charity. As wonderful as that would be, none of us would be doing this right now if there wasn't some form of a reward or a benefit. So we deserve at least some compensation for the work that we're putting into this. At least that's my opinion. Will, I mean, I have to imagine you agree. I know the other contributors are on board with that.
So, it is kind of, not to divulge too much, but it's like a flat rate per article, basically. Yeah. It's kind of what we're getting. And so any article you see coming out by me or by Alex or Jordan, whoever, it's a flat rate for that article. I don't know. I mean, again, nobody's retiring off of this. I mean, I guess if I was in retirement, this would be kind of a fun little side gig job, but this is kind of like a little side gig that kind of, I would just say it funds the hobby. Maybe I break even on the hobby. Maybe I don't know that I come out that much ahead on the hobby, but it just kind of funds the hobby is kind of how I've looked at it, because I was doing a lot of this stuff anyways. I was already through the Brew Club publishing experiment articles, maybe not with this frequency, but I was doing this kind of thing anyways. And so this kind of just like funds this hobby. And I think the real if I'm gonna be honest, the real payment of it all is just the ability to come on and have opportunities to do podcasts with Marshall, and then also meet other people in the brewing world, either in person or virtually, and get some of those really cool experiences that I don't know that I would have available to me otherwise, except for through Brülosophy.
Yeah. No, I think that's, you and I are on the same boat. I think what's really kept me doing this isn't the money. That would be a joke, actually. And people think, I know for a fact, people think we're lying about that. One, because I've heard that from people overtly, but before Brülosophy, I listened to popular podcasts, whether it was about homebrewing or other things. And I just had this illusion that these guys were raking it in. I'm now friends with a lot of these podcasters, and I'm telling you, their experience matches ours. We are not an anomaly here. This is a small segment of the population who are interested in brewing and beer, an even smaller segment that listens to what we're doing, and an even smaller segment willing to throw a few dollars our way every month to support what we're doing. This is not going to make anybody rich. I wish it would. I feel like I would happily increase the compensation rates for what we're doing for contributors if I could, because I feel like you guys deserve it. I feel like we all deserve it, but that's just not the case. So somebody asked recently all of the different avenues that we have for revenue generation. So I'll kind of break that down. I do think it's interesting. Again, this is all stuff that I learned on my own. For the most part, it was because somebody else came along and was like, dude, you could be making a little bit of cash if you do this, or, have you considered doing this, whatever. And so over, the last 9.5 years, I've brought on a lot of these things in an attempt to, keep us afloat and to keep us doing what we're doing. So the first thing that we ever did after starting the website is it was actually kind of interesting. The first iteration of Brülosophy.com was actually WordPress.Brülosophy.com. And there was a way you could pay like $10 a month or something, and they would allow you to just use Brülosophy.com, but it would still go to it would like redirect to their WordPress website. And so we did that, and they had just announced or integrated some form of like in-house advertising. And so I signed up for that. I was invited to sign up for that because I had a certain number of page views. The site was doing surprisingly well. And I remember like the first payment on that, I think was like $85 for the first full month. And it blew my mind. I was like, wow, this whole thing that I'm doing for fun just paid me $85. That's beer money, And so then that was pretty normal for a few months. And somebody had told me, somebody who I know who works for WordPress was like, well, if you're on your own server, you can actually integrate things like Google AdSense, which is the go-to, advertising thing. And so I did, oh my God, all of the work, which for me was a bear because I'd never done it before, to get on our own server, to have everything transferred over. And that gave us total freedom over what we put on the website. We were no longer limited by what WordPress allowed. And that's when we started running Google AdSense. And I made a commitment at the time. I made a commitment to not overdoing it. But again, we needed something to support. I was spending so much money on ingredients at the time. I mean, it was not sustainable. My wife was like, dude, you got to chill out or find a way to cover this that's not coming out of, our family funds. And so that was how I did it, was through, first off was through the advertising. And then after that, it was soon thereafter, in fact, it was affiliate links. And somebody had told me about More Beer having a great affiliate link program. So I think they were the first ones I signed up with. And then we did Amazon. And after that, it just was kind of all of the popular at the time homebrewing websites. So you had, Northern Brewer, you had Adventures in Homebrewing, Midwest Supplies. I think we did one with Austin Homebrewing or whatever. So that, and that ended up, for a while there, that ended up being a very helpful form of generating revenue. I think we were bringing in almost like $200-$300 a month just off of affiliate links. And so that was really cool. Well, after about 1.5 2 years of kind of floating on that and just breaking even, which we were happy with, is when we started, making inroads with sponsors. And by sponsors at the time, they were just other businesses that we had been in communication with because of the exposure we were getting at the time. So we made friends with the guys from Jaded Brewing, Clay Disney. We made friends with the folks from More Beer, and we started talking to these people. And this is around the time when other people who were creating the same type of content, at least in the same, topic as us, John Palmer, the guys from the Brewing Network, all of that stuff. You kind of get plugged into that and you start talking about stuff and getting ideas from them and whatnot. So we did start bringing on some sponsors. In the beginning, the sponsors were largely, hey, we're going to give you this product to review in exchange for some exposure on it. And we still do that quite a bit, but then eventually it did lead to, not for the website so much, but more for the podcast, to paid sponsorships, kind of a more traditional format.
So, and I love our sponsors. As I said, I think in a previous podcast, like a lot of our sponsors, like Imperial and YVH and those guys, I was using a lot of their products before I ever became a part of Brülosophy. And so I love your approach to actually some of the sponsorship stuff. Now the dynamic web advertising, that's hilarious to me, because sometimes you get some really off the wall things, like some weird, I think it was some weird thing to help, people that are females genetically stand up and pee, and that's they have a little cup that shows up on mine every now and again. There's some random underwear ads it's really spiky underwear. I'm sure it's super comfy, and so I think the ad set stuff is hilarious, and I know you've been doing more of that with the podcast as well, as like inserting those dynamic ads. I think I've heard it on the Brew Lab more recently. So what brought on that?
Yeah, I hate to say it. I've been trying not. I know that you guys are probably getting sick about hearing about Patreon and all of these other things. There's a reason for that. I don't want to whine too much. Nothing like that. But we have had to introduce over the last 6 months or so dynamic advertising into both this podcast as well as the Brew Lab. The whole reason is because of the crazy times we're in brewing. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. We've lost sponsors over the years because they're out of business, or they're just not generating the revenue they were 5 years ago. And so they can't pay up. We've adjusted some of our sponsorship costs because of that, or we're not. We're doing surprisingly well. The Brülosophy podcast in particular is yielding, on average over 100,000 downloads per month, which for a small podcast in this very specific field of brewing and beer, that's not too shabby. The problem is the people who would normally advertise with us don't have the resources to do that right now. Not only that, the focus just isn't on marketing. At this point, the focus is on staying afloat. It's on keeping the door open to your homebrew shop or whatever. And so our way of compensating, it honestly is to introduce these dynamic ads. And we're really fortunate because our podcast server, Libsyn, has their own dynamic ad insertion program that allows you to select, different levels of basically, the types of ads they're going to run. But we've chosen not to run anything overtly political or, whatever it might be. So the ads shouldn't be too in your face or too bad, but we have to do that. And as annoying as it might be for some of our listeners who are anti-advertising, again, I don't know what to tell you. If you're listening to this show, you're getting it for free, first off. So, you don't have much room to complain. And we would be more than happy to get rid of those ads if just a small segment, if 3% of our monthly listeners, of the people who are downloading this show, if just 3% of them would make the move to throwing in $3 to $5 a month on our Patreon, we wouldn't have to deal with any ads whatsoever. But that's just not the case. People don't want to do that, and so this is the way we deal with that. And it is what it is. We have to do it. So that's where we're at with those ads. They are pretty funny. When we first started integrating them into this podcast, Will, I went and I'm listening to the ads, like what are they showing to me? And they're funny. So kind of like you with the website, for me on the podcast, the ones I'm hearing are like Border Patrol job openings.
I've heard that one. That one's so good. And I'm like, and I live like in South Texas. I'm like, wow, it's so wild that Brülosophy is advertising for Border Patrol, but whatever.
Yeah, I didn't pick those. But again, I also don't mind. I have no shame in admitting that we have to, I am not going to dip into my family's funds to keep this thing of mine afloat. As much as I love this, that's just not how it's going to work. So, and I think most people can understand that. So other avenues of revenue generation for us that we've played with include merchandise, selling shirts, which right now currently exists only on Amazon. And we've done other things in the past. We even had a whole bunch of stuff ordered to my place, had stock of stuff. And my wife, her focus for those 2 months was on packaging, shipping, managing all of that stuff. It was absolute hell. That is not something I ever want to put anybody through again. So we decided not to do that. We are absolutely open to other options for merch. Whether we know I'm constantly getting requests for our glasses, our tasting glasses. I know they're pretty cool. We appreciate hearing that, but people want to pay for those. And that's one way for us to generate more revenue. We just haven't found a really good way to do that. That doesn't require any more of my time. I don't have any more time to give, or isn't too much work. So if you have ideas out there, if that's something you're into, feel free to reach out. You can hit us up at feedback@brülosophy.com and I'll take a look at, any of those options. But our biggest form of revenue generation, and I don't think people understand how true it is when I say that if it weren't for Patreon, we wouldn't be here. Patreon is what pays for all of this. It truly is. It's the reason that I talk about it as much as I do. And what I love about it is that in addition to knowing that you are getting, the Brülosophy podcast, all of our web content, the Brülosophy show, that your support at $3 or $5 or $10 a month is going to support that, you're also getting monthly rewards for it. So it's something a little extra in addition to keeping us around. It is so incredibly important. And again, if we were just to get a tiny little sliver, 2 to 3% of the people who listen to this podcast every single month were to like in one fell swoop were to say, you know what, we're going to go give $5 a month to Brülosophy to help them keep doing what they're doing. You wouldn't hear another ad on this show ever, because that would cover those costs that we're trying to recover from losing stuff, due to the lull in brewing right now. So that's just the fact of the matter. And so those are really the financial sides of things. I don't know what else it is people want to know. Maybe Will, as somebody who was on the outside, for so long, up until a year and a half ago, maybe you have some questions that I didn't quite hit on. I'm not going to go into specific numbers. One, because I'm not sure I know them all the time. It's ever changing. I will say that the amount that we're generating today is markedly lower than what it was 5 years ago, but that hasn't changed the compensation that I give to that we give to contributors for what they're doing. It's just coming out of the savings aspect of Brülosophy, and that's because I think that's the contributors are what really keep this thing alive, and they don't deserve to be hit by things that are going on in the world today. So
just to verify, the $5 Patreon is the one where you get like a kickback or some discount from Yakima Valley, right?
Yeah, if you give $5 a month, you get you'll get access to a never before published recipe, and then at $3 you'll get the access to our live Q&A sessions every month, and these are a lot of fun. They're really intimate. I mean, this, like I said, in September, you did it last month, Will, and so you know what it's like to be on that side of the mic, but you've also been a part of a lot of these Q&A sessions. Coming up in September again is John Palmer. I mean, you get to sit down with 5 or 6 people is usually who makes it to these things, and just lob questions at somebody in the brewing world, like John Palmer, and they're talking directly to you. I mean, for $3 a month, that's pretty cool, I think. And then at $5, you get a discount code that is specifically for patrons of Brülosophy from our friends at Yakima Valley Hops. And I would say that 99% of the time, the discount code is for more than $5. 100% of the time, it's for at least $5 off of something. But a lot of the times it's like, hey, take $5 off each 1 pound bag of this hop that you're going to buy. So you could buy 3 bags of it, 3 bags of 1 pound bags of hops, and you're saving $15 right there. So we really try to make it worth the patrons' while. So
funny story though. Like I did the $5 tier as a patron of Brülosophy before I was a contributor, right? And they had like $5 off whole cone hops. I was like, oh, cool. I've never really brewed with whole cone hops. I bought like 3 pounds of whole cone hops, not really thinking about how much space they would take up in my freezer. Holy cow, a pound of whole cone hops takes up so much space in your freezer. Like half a pound is like double the size of a pound bag of like pelletized hops. But again, that was $5 off each pound. So my $5 contribution saved me $15 on hops. And that there's stuff like that all the time that they're doing, which I just want to point out is really cool. Another question I had about the merch, and this is just kind of like way back on podcasts from I forget how many years ago. Y'all were doing the Amazon shirts back then as well, but I think y'all were talking about maybe partnering with YVH or somebody for merch. Is there still any talk about that, or do you have any insights you're willing to share about what happened to kind of that train of thought?
Yeah, we actually did it. We partnered with Yakima Valley Hops, and what ultimately ended up happening is our designs that we were using for the t-shirts that we had been selling on Teespring originally, and then we moved to Amazon. Those weren't used. Some of the design ideas were used, but their marketing person, who's incredible, went and had some kind of like modern looking designs made that were just different. But because of that, and because of the nicer quality shirts, arguably, I'm not a big fan of like the super thin, soft shirts that a lot of people are wearing these days. I like the old school kind of thick, Gildan 50/50 shirts, but that's what we were doing. Well, the new ones were like the baseball tees that have like the ringer around the arms, and then and that was like bright white, so easily dirtied if you're drinking beer and spilling it on yourself. There were the really soft t-shirts, and we got a whole bunch of them. And so what ultimately happened was we were selling them. They weren't selling too fast because we had to charge more for them because they were more expensive. Higher quality means more money. But a lot of people bought them. They're really cool. I still see a ton of people wearing them, whether that's locally here in Fresno or people online who are at events and whatnot. So I know they're out there, but we had so many of them that ultimately what we did is once the cost of those was recovered, we started using those shirts largely as giveaways. And so we were running giveaway things, some locally, other contributors at the time took big amounts of them and were giving them away and stuff like that. So we still have, that's still an open possibility. The thing is, like a lot of companies out there right now in this industry, Yakima Valley Hops closed up their storefront. So they are still absolutely open. They're an online shop, but you can't they're not a homebrew shop anymore that you can go to and get your stuff from like that. They had to adjust to the changing, the way things are changing nowadays. So, but that's still an option. I think right now, the biggest thing we're looking for in terms of merch is somebody who's willing to drop ship all of the stuff the people who are, our fans, the people who listen and read what we do want, which are hats, glasses, t-shirts, stuff like that. A lot of the places might do hats and t-shirts, but they don't do drinking glasses, or the opposite, and so it's just a matter of finding something that works for us, for all of that stuff.
Right. And I've seen some places that'll do like made to print glasses as well and ship them, but most of the time, like the options for those glasses is like a shaker pint and not really much else, and that's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, and they're charging $15 for one shaker pint when I could go order a whole case of nicer, small, like our Think Beer glasses right now. I could get 600 of those for under $1,000 and sell them for $5 a piece. The problem is, how am I going to do that? How are we going to get those shipped? Well, now you got to pay a company to do it for you, and now you're charging much more money for these glasses that I just don't think people want to spend that much money on. Maybe I'm wrong, but I wouldn't want to. When we did it before, we were selling, I think we sold, it was something like 3 taster glasses for $12 or something. I mean, it was a pretty good deal, but you had to cover shipping, well, that adds another $10 right there. So people felt like they were getting an okay deal, but it's a hard pill to swallow when all they are these taster glasses, and again, I'm letting my own opinions and thoughts get in the way of me, making the jump at times. I get that, but I just don't want people to feel like they're getting ripped off, or I also don't want to have a whole bunch of stuff that I'm sitting on and doesn't sell. So, again, we have to take a risk at some point, but right now it's just on Amazon. I have heard, again, as an aside, that Amazon is coming up with ways to integrate more than just t-shirts and such. So maybe that will be an option in the future if we don't do anything else.
I think it'd be really cool, maybe, and maybe this would be like a Patreon thing, where you just get people to sign up and they agree to pay at least some fee, and you order that amount and then ship it out. And I know that's a lot of processing and things, but I think that might be a cool perk for Patreon, maybe.
Well, so Patreon actually has a merch type of deal, but it's all set up on a reward tier thing, kind of the way Patreon works, right? So at a certain point, you've contributed $1,000 to Brülosophy over the last 10 years or whatever, then you would get a t-shirt or something. But the thing is the amount that Patreon charges for that, charges the creator, me, is exorbitant. Again, I don't think people want. Yeah, that's great. You got a t-shirt, but I doubt that if you knew that your $5 a month it took 6 of those to pay for that t-shirt that you're wearing and we got nothing from it, then what's the point in supporting the podcast when we're using that to pay for server space and security and ingredients and all that stuff? So again, it's there. It's like the option is there, but it's just kind of out of our, it's just out of, it doesn't really make sense to do it is the way I look at it. So, do you feel like we've covered the financial side of things well enough? Again, I know that some people are going to be just pining for us to talk about numbers. I'll tell you this, that I don't make anywhere near what I'd be making if I was working a part-time or a full-time minimum wage job. We'll put it that way. None of the contributors are. So
I could probably go work part-time pouring beers at the place down the street and probably get more in tips, honestly.
I guarantee you would get more in tips make more money doing that than you do doing Brülosophy. Same here. But again, it is a labor of love on many levels. I don't want it to sound like it's 100% sacrifice. That would be foolish. It's not. We have other benefits as well, being plugged into, the industry side of things, which is, I just think, a lot of fun, very rewarding in and of itself. But again, I'm not going to hide behind, the money thing either. If we were able to generate more and I'm not going to say no to that. I see the value in that. So let's move on from the money talk and talk a little bit more about something that I think is kind of fun, which is, I think we've done an entire episode on this as well, but just dealing with the different types of feedback that we've gotten over the years.
Man, the feedback is anything from "this is amazing, I love this" to just to reference earlier, I probably have killed someone with a coffee beer, according to some of the feedback I've gotten. But I think it's great. Like, I think that's just the state of the internet. Like you said, everybody here has pretty thick skin for the most part. I do kind of laugh sometimes at some of the feedback we get, because it's some of it's like really spot on, really correct. Some of it is a little more sanctimonious. And then some of it is just like out there, and I'm not really sure where it's coming from. So I kind of love it all. I've been begging Martin to let us do like I'm similar to a mean tweets, but like a mean feedback section on the Brülosophy show, where you just have a video of me talking to a microphone, reading some of the feedback that I've gotten, good, bad, or indifferent. I think that would be hilarious. I don't know that we've bitten on that yet, but that could be 10 minutes of just, not even like 10 minutes, maybe just have an opener for like a month or something, where maybe I read one week, Steve reads another week, you read another week. It would just be hilarious.
Yeah, that would be. The whole mean tweets thing was always hilarious. We actually did something like that on an episode where it was one of our live episodes with Jersey and Tim, and I had them read some of the comments that people were leaving, actually in Apple Podcast, specifically about Jersey and Tim, and it was hilarious. I think that'd be a good one. Yeah, there's something about what we do that yields just a variety of different type of feedback. And the way I view it is, there is positive feedback, so encouraging feedback, that drives me crazy. There's the encouraging stuff that is just, to me, is very nice and it fits, it jibes with my thoughts. And then there's just the negative stuff. And there's something about the internet that seems to bring out the insecure people, and the people who like to hide behind an anonymous username or whatever it is. If you want to see some hilariously negative feedback, just go to the homebrewing subreddit. Holy moly. We actually, because of the reality that we seemed to be annoying more people there than we weren't, just by sharing what we were doing, we've all but stopped sharing our stuff on Reddit, and lo and behold, it hasn't had much of an impact on our numbers at all. So but it is pretty wild, some of the stuff that we've been told. I received an email a couple years ago from somebody who was just named Bob. I wasn't planning on ever reading his feedback on the air, but when I got it, it cracked me up. I forget exactly what it said, but it was one sentence that in essence said, you don't know what you're doing and you're ruining home brewing, period. Okay. Thank you so much, Bob.
I do think there are a fair number of traditionalists out there that, and again, if you've, I'm not trying to bag on traditional brewing methods, because I think they're valuable, and I like to do them from time to time as well. But I do think there are a fair amount of traditionalists out there that feel like we are just personally attacking them because we're attacking their brewing methods. And I think we go out of our way every time to say, hey, brew how you want to brew. Like, we're not trying to tell you to do anything different, but it doesn't seem to matter how many times you say that. It's going to come off the wrong way, because we have this thing as people where if you attack some idea or belief I hold, you're attacking me personally. And that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. Well, and it's just beer, but people personalize everything. The truth of the matter is this: if there's anything that I have learned in my almost 20 years as in the realm of psychology, as a psychologist, as a grad school student, all of that, it's that people want to feel right. They want to feel like what they're doing matters. It's a very human thing to pine for that. Nobody's going to intentionally desire feeling wrong. I like to put myself in positions where I could be proved wrong because I'm a masochist on that level, I suppose. But in general, people don't want that. So if we come out, even with something as banal as a brewing process, and we say, hey, look, this doesn't seem, in this specific experiment, it didn't seem that this variable had the impact that we expected. There are people who interpret that as, you're telling me that I'm wasting my time? Huh? Really? I'm going to go comment on your article now, or your Reddit thing, your Reddit post. And it's just wild to me because we have said over and over and over again, that's not the intention. That's never the intention of any form of science that I'm aware of. Rather, we're just sharing entertaining, interesting findings that we found that surprised us just as much as anybody else. But people don't like that. The thing is that sometimes, like I said, there are the encouraging comments that we get, that encouraging feedback that still drives me crazy. And I feel like it's still influenced by that same, desire to feel like things matter. I cannot stand, and then I know there's a lot of people out there who probably do this, are doing it right now even, and listen to the show, and we love you, but don't mince our data. Don't rely on a single data point to prove, I put that in air quotes, to prove that you don't need to do something, or to prove that you do need to do something. This is just brewing. Everything in this field, in this hobby is a choice. Yes, you have to mash. Do you have to mash for half an hour, 60 minutes, 90 minutes? That's up in the air. Do what you want to do. But I cannot stand when people are like, they send me these really supportive emails. Oh, thank you so much for proving that I can, do it this way, and I don't have to do this, and I can ferment a lager at 68 degrees. And that's not what our point is, so that doesn't annoy me quite as much as the people who tell us that clearly we're lying, oh, you guys are lying. You made that up. You probably fermented both cold. I can't believe anybody would think we would do that. I don't see what the point of that would be. Or the people who the fun one to me is, clearly your tasters have bad palates. Well, hey dude, I've been doing this for 20 years and I couldn't tell the difference either. Well, clearly you have a bad palate, man. Maybe you should probably, perform some of these experiments yourself and test your own palate. How about that?
So there's two critiques, and one is the palate critique. And I've had to answer this question to people in person that have asked me, do I think they would be different if we had BJCP judges or whoever doing these tests? And I just remind them that the difference between a BJCP judge, if you had two identical people that had the identical genetic makeup, that's impossible. But let's say you have two clones. One's a BJCP certified judge, the other one isn't. The only difference in their palate is the ability to describe what they're tasting.
That's it. Yeah.
And so and I know we've covered this before, I know you've talked about this ad nauseum, but really these people, that we're getting, sure, they may not be able to pick out that what they're tasting is this astringent character or grapefruit or whatever the flavor is. But when you're doing a blind triangle test, that doesn't matter. All you're trying to pick is what color cup is different. That's it.
Yeah.
End story. Now, one criticism that does come up again that I think is worth covering on, because it is kind of fair, is our sample sizes are usually 20-ish people, maybe a little more, but usually 20 or higher. And for statistical analysis, 20 isn't this great big huge number, right? And in fact, if we were going to do this for real, because we're real scientists, we would probably conduct the same experiment over and over and over again until we got thousands of participants. And so that's why I think people saying that because of our data, you can definitely say this. You definitely can't, because our sample sizes aren't gigantic. But that said, when you come at me saying, well, when me and my friend did this and so you're wrong. Well, my sample size is 20 plus people. Yeah. Your sample size is you and your buddy in your garage, that tried them side by side and knew there was a difference. So that it's not the same thing.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the thing, dude, is and this is where I came up with my retort to that, which is, oh man, but me and my friend in my garage, we did it and we could easily tell a difference. And I said, well, yeah, but that is not science. What you're doing is you're taking I did the same thing before Brülosophy. Every time I employed a new approach, imagine that. It came out that I could perceive the impact of this little approach. It wasn't until I actually started doing side-by-sides that I realized just how biased I was, or how much that regular bias that we all possess was influencing my perceptions. I mean, that is what I study. That is my field of regular work, is the way we perceive the world and how that impacts the way we approach the world, our behavior, our conceptions, all of that stuff. If you think that you and your buddy who have been brewing for 2 years have a better palate than 25 people who have been drinking, brewing on a professional scale even for 15 plus years, then I'm proud of you. You're clearly proud of yourself, but give it a shot. Do the real thing. Our data points are always from people who are blind to the variable. They don't know what's going on. We can argue that as well, but the truth of the matter is, it is more science than the people who are just, doing these things in their garage to try to prove to themselves that a small variable has some impact. But the thing is, I've been there, so I understand it. But that is my response, that, hey, what we're doing is at least marginally more scientific than what you're doing. And so if you want to call us out on us not being scientific, then go do something better, and the other thing to keep in mind in developing our approach, if you go back and look at our very first experiments, probably the first, 6 or 7 of them were one thing. They weren't consistent. We did something different almost every time, but it's far different than what we're doing today. And that's because we started consulting with actual sensory scientists on this approach. That's how we settled on the minimum being 20. We were actually told minimum for sensory analysis on what we're doing, 15 would be appropriate. So we set it at 20. We set our threshold at 20 because we wanted to get past that. We've done comparisons of performance, experiment triangle test performance between BJCP judges, between people who are recognized judges, who interestingly enough seem to have a higher, the whole Dunning-Kruger effect. They seem to have a higher view of their abilities than people who've been judging for more years, who have more experience under their belt. But everybody performs about the same. I mean, my Coors Light drinking neighbors did just as good as my 5-year BJCP, certified judges were doing. So the ability to distinguish is not so much, something that BJCP judges have, but like you said, Will, it's the ability to describe what they're tasting better. And that's fair, so, but yeah, that is the feedback that we get. It's good. It's bad. Sometimes it's a little bit ugly, but it is what it is. We have been accused of some pretty gnarly things at times, things that are far worse than even falsifying data. There have been some accusations thrown our way that I've just had to ignore and hope they go away. And thankfully, I think they have. But you have to ask yourself, what is this for? I mean, we've had DDoS attacks on our website. Who the hell is setting up a DDoS attack for a small brewing website? I don't get it. But there are people out there who don't want us doing what we're doing, and so they'll make stuff up about us. They make these claims, and it's just, again, back up, trust that people trust who we are, and that we're not doing anything too sleazy, and kind of move on. And we've been able to make it so far. So
yeah, and if you think you're, I'm faking any of my experiments, just call my wife and she'll complain about random fermenters being scattered throughout the house at times, and all the random, stupid anal things I'm doing to make sure these things come out the best that they can, to the point where it drives you crazy, trying to make sure you're controlling for as much as you possibly can. You can never be perfect, but we're trying to get close.
Yeah. As close as we can in our garages, a couple of people who work in different industries for their real lives, but who love brewing enough to, to test this stuff out. So, I've got a question for you, Will. You've been around for about 1.5 years now. So your experience probably a little bit different than mine when it comes to any changes that you've experienced, just in your views of brewing and beer in general, or of brewers, of home brewing, because of your being so integrated into this side of things, where you're seeing that level of feedback, or where you're seeing, you go to an event and people recognize who you are, or something like that. Is there anything that you felt kind of perspective wise that's changed because of your involvement with Brülosophy?
It's confirmed a lot of things for me. Like this, what we have here in brewing is special. Like the communities that we have, the people that we have, it is a special community. And I think it's not like a super spread out one either. Like the big names are fairly accessible. for the most part. Like John Palmer coming to our Patreon thing this next month in September. Like that's pretty good accessibility, and there's that kind of accessibility through all this stuff, and so maybe it's a little bit more accessible on this side of the curtain than the other one, but it is such a great community, such a tight knit community. Lots of great people. So that hasn't changed. One thing that is kind of interesting is you tell people you're with Brülosophy, and some people will just assume that you're this amazing brewer. I'm not even sure. I'm in my local homebrew club, and especially the brew club virtually, I'm not sure I'm the best brewer in either of those clubs. Am I a good brewer? Yes, I think I'm a good brewer. But there are definitely people that are out there doing way better in competitions than me, getting way more medals, that are more talented brewers than myself. It's just what's driving them is different, especially competitive-minded people than myself. Because when I enter competitions, I do it for weird, funky things, like I'm trying to see if the short and shoddy will medal in this category.
Yeah,
not necessarily to win all the medals. And so I just want people to know that, we're people, and I think all of us are good brewers. I think we're all well above average, but there are better out there for sure.
I think one of the things, a quality of Brülosophy that I've really aimed to promote is just being humble, and not overly humble, not meek, but being humble. We understand that there are going to be people out there who disagree with our findings, and that frustrates them. I'm not gonna lash out at you because you think that we messed up on the experiment or anything like that. But if anything has shifted in my perspective, there's a few things. I mean, it's been almost 10 years that I've been involved in this. There are people out there who don't share that desire for humility. They want to sound like the professional. They want to sound like they're the expert. And I'm not big on expertism. I feel like if you accept that you're an expert, you've cut yourself off from learning even more. Now I've been told, but because of your experience, you are technically an expert. Well, that's fine. But I'll tell you, I value staying open to learning new things, experimenting more with things, stuff like that. It's been really amazing to me just to kind of sit back and watch this industry that I am a part of, by virtue of the fact of Brülosophy existing, not because of choice necessarily, and to look at the things that people are willing to say or do in public that maybe they don't do behind, when they're not in the public light, stuff like that. That's been kind of an interesting observation. I think more so because I notice stuff like that, given my interests in human psychology and stuff. So that's been interesting. I've also realized that homebrewing really is full of, for the most part, incredible people who just want to make this thing fun, and I feel like that's what's kept us alive. There are a very vocal minority of people who are going to make it seem at times like, man, what we're doing is for naught. It's just, this is so much work for people just to shit on it. But the reality is that our stats don't align with that. We have so many people who read what we're putting out, who listen to it. And in doing that are supporting us, but they just don't speak up so much about it. And that is fine. We're not looking to get inundated with feedback emails telling us how great we are. But thank you to the person who sent us some praise recently, by the way. That was really touching. But yeah, so that piece of it is there. There are really good people in this hobby. I don't understand why it seems to attract folks who look like you and me, Will, and not many people outside of that. But hopefully, as we open ourselves up to embracing differences more and such, we can attract, a different swath of people. I think that'd be amazing as well. But I love it. I wouldn't be in this for as long as I have if I didn't feel like the people are good, and for the most part, I think we are. So it's just been interesting to witness some of the stuff that we have. So I haven't really changed much in my brewing, in my perspectives on brewers, the people involved. In terms of beer or the brewing aspect of things, people always ask, how have you changed because of the experiments? I mean, I do the short and shoddy thing now. That is a purely based off of our experiment findings from the past. But I have no qualms with people who want to brew traditionally. In fact, Jordan Folks, if he's doing an experiment and he's brewing a pale lager for that experiment, 9 times out of 10, he's doing a step mash. We've shown that step mashes don't seem to have any impact whatsoever. He still does them. We don't care. Do it, do your thing. Just because a finding suggested something doesn't mean we're encouraging anybody to do or not do those things. So final question. And this one comes from a person who just on a post that I put up a while ago said, I just want to know if it's all been worth it. You know, you've been doing this for almost 10 years now. Has it been worth it? And my response to that is I think it just depends on how you define worth. Financially, has it been worth it? I think the easy answer there is probably not. I've been able to pay for beer, for myself for the better part of maybe 6 or 7 years now. So that's cool, but I don't need that. I've got a decent paying real job. I think what's made it worth it is my involvement, my experience, with the homebrewing world and being able to go to events and talk to people and hearing that some of the stuff that we're doing has had a positive influence in the way people experience this hobby. And to me, that makes it very much worth it. What about you, Will?
I think you and I value similar things, and I think our ability with Brülosophy to at least spark conversations around certain topics within the brewing world and the brewing space is totally worth it. Financially, I'm with you. Like having some beer money is great. Having the ability to maybe splurge on a piece of equipment before I would have otherwise because I got some extra cash hanging out, awesome. But in the same token, I just think what we've done as far as sparking conversations around different processes, around different topics, and for the most part, it's been positive conversations, positive things to talk about, and positive things around what perceptible impacts there are out there. And so to me, that is totally worth it just to have a conversation starter around some of these topics and to go in there with not just an idea of what it is that I read in a book, but to have some people that are out there going out and getting actual data on these variables that are brewing more similar to you than not. And I think that's totally worth it in the long run.
Couldn't agree more, man. And I know there's a lot in this episode. There's also a lot that we didn't hit on. So feel free to shoot us emails, ask us the questions. We may do a follow-up. I don't know. Or maybe we'll just answer them via email. But that is the Cliff's Notes version of Brülosophy and everything that it's taken to build this thing, to keep it going. And we appreciate everybody who is out there listening now. We appreciate in particular, the people who are throwing $3, $4, $5 our way on Patreon. I mean, God, again, you guys are the reason we're doing this. We're able to do this even. So thank you so much for that. Don't forget to check out our podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating research they're doing on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we are up to. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no